Sarah was driving calmly, satisfied with another day at work, until red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. A blitz. She pulled over, expecting a routine inspection. There was something dangerous in the air, and Sarah knew it. This blitz wasn't just routine, and she had a feeling something much worse was about to happen. Sarah drove slowly down the road, feeling the weight of the hours of work piling up on her body. The radio played softly, while her thoughts wandered to her recent achievements. She had worked hard to get where she was, a black woman in a system that at every turn seemed to want to bring her down. But today, Sarah could breathe a little easier, at least for the time being. The red and blue lights in the rearview mirror interrupted her daydreams, blinking insistently, accompanied by the muffled noise of a siren. A blitz. Just one more, she thought, slowing down and pulling the car over to the side of the road. She already knew what was coming next. The routine procedure. They would ask for her documents, ask a few quick questions, and let her go. The road seemed quiet, almost empty, and Sarah just wanted to get home. But as she handed over her documents, something in the policeman's eyes caught her attention. He was tall with a closed face, too serious for the situation. He seemed to stare at her with a look that didn't match the calmness of the moment. Instead of handing back the documents, he took a step back and said in a cold voice, "Get out of the car, please." That simple sentence hit her like a rock. It made no sense. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew where this was going, but she didn't react. She couldn't. Even so, every fiber in her body warned of danger. Something was wrong, but she had to keep control. Standing next to the car, Sarah watched as the policeman began to search her vehicle. He searched her bags, tossing her belongings around without any respect, all without a single explanation. She forced herself to remain calm, even as her discomfort grew. Around her, the atmosphere of the approach was changing. Other police officers approached slowly, like predators smelling easy prey. What at first seemed like a simple route and check turned into something darker. Sarah didn't need words to understand. She'd been in situations like this before. The judgment, the mistrust, the same feeling of helplessness returned to dominate her chest. She saw them exchange quick glances, as if they already knew something she didn't. It was a look she already knew well. It was a look she already knew well. Prejudice disguised as authority, something subtle, but so clear that it was impossible to ignore. Sarah felt the tension in their every gesture, their every sudden movement, her belongings being rummaged through, her dignity slowly being stripped away. Time seemed to drag on, and the sound of the wind hitting the road was the only noise apart from the shredding of papers and the dry click of the zippers of their bags being opened. Every second she tried to keep her posture, but her stomach was turning. She knew it wouldn't end well. The policeman paused, holding something in his hands that he had taken out of her bag. He lifted the object and, with a confused expression, looked at Sarah, not understanding what was in her hands. But she didn't need to say anything yet. She just waited. At that moment, she knew that the game was far from over. Sarah stood outside the car, feeling the cold night wind hit her face. The deserted road seemed to get longer as the minutes passed, and every move the police made her feel even more uncomfortable. The heavy silence was interrupted only by the sound of the officer's hands going through her things, as if she wasn't there, as if she didn't own any of it. She looked down at her trembling hands, trying to disguise her nervousness, while the officer's stares burned her from the inside. Sarah had always known that her skin color would be a factor that night, but now, watching the men slowly approach, she felt the weight of humiliation build up in her chest. One of them stopped in front of her, his eyes fixed on hers, without even disguising the distrust that emanated from every gesture. "What are you doing here at this hour?" asked the younger man, his voice full of arrogance. She felt her blood rise but controlled herself. The urge to respond in kind was there, throbbing, but Sarah knew that any misplaced words would be used against her. She took a deep breath, holding in her anger, and replied, "Coming home from work." He arched an eyebrow, sneering at the simplicity of the answer. It was as if, for him, the idea of a woman like her, black and alone on that road, was automatically suspicious. And Sarah knew it. She knew it from the moment they made her get out of the car for no reason. On the other side, another policeman, older and with a serious countenance, picked up her documents and without even looking at her said, Your attitude only makes things worse. It's very strange here." Strange? Sarah couldn't believe it. What could be strange about someone driving home after a long day at work? But she knew what he meant. She knew that strange wasn't about what she did, but about who she was. And that outweighed any justification she could give. Meanwhile, the discomfort grew. The other policeman began to open the trunk, rummaging through it without any ceremony. Her handbag, which had previously held her day's achievements, was now being displayed in a vulgar manner, her belongings thrown on the floor as if they were mere objects of no value. Standing there, Sarah felt the humiliation spreading. With each passing second, the injustice of the moment became clearer. She knew that the approach had nothing to do with suspicion, but with who she was, or what they imagined her to be. And as much as she wanted to shout, to stand up for herself, she understood that at that moment her only weapon was silence. The stares continued, critical, full of judgment. A group of pedestrians began to notice what was happening and watch the scene from afar. Sarah could see that the discomfort was not hers alone, but permeated the air. Sarah remained motionless, watching as the policemen rummaged through the trunk, their heavy hands tossing objects from one side to the other, as if nothing there had any value. Her heart was pounding, but she knew there was no point in reacting. Every part of her screamed that this wasn't right, that she hadn't done anything to deserve such treatment. But she knew they were waiting for a reaction, a slip, anything to justify the way they treated her. From where she stood, Sarah saw other policemen slowly approaching. None of them said anything, but the look of contempt was enough. It was as if they had already decided who she was before she even opened her mouth. Frustration boiled inside her, growing by the second, but she kept it under control. She knew that losing her temper would only make things worse. "What's this?" shouted one of the policemen, holding up an object he had found at the bottom of the suitcase. Sarah looked at him, and even though she couldn't clearly see what he was holding, she knew it was one of the many personal items he was carrying. He stared at her as if he had found some incriminating evidence, but there was nothing illegal there. Even so, the tone of his voice made it clear that no matter what it was, the mere fact that it belonged to her already made it suspicious. "Can you explain?" he insisted, waving the object in the air. She wanted to laugh. The situation was so absurd. It was all so ridiculous, but at the same time so predictable. It didn't matter what she said. In those men's minds, she was already doomed. "You'll find out soon enough," Sarah replied, her voice calm but full of frustration. The policeman frowned, not understanding what she meant. He was hoping for an explanation, a confession, something to validate the unjustified mistrust he had felt from the start. But Sarah wasn't going to give him that. She knew that anything she said would be twisted and used against her. The other policeman continued with the search, ignoring any request for an explanation she might make. To them, Sarah was just another black woman, alone on that road, easy to intimidate. Their every move, every disguised laugh between the officers, only fueled the frustration building up inside her. She knew that no matter how polite or collaborative she was, the judgment was already made. And that was the frustration. Having no power over her own story, being thrust into a role she didn't choose, where her skin color made her guilty before there was even a crime. The tension was almost palpable as a luxury car approached the blitz. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and suspicion as the door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out. He walked with firm steps toward the group of policemen, his gaze serious and his posture imposing, as if he already knew exactly what was happening there. The officers seemed not to notice him for a moment, still busy searching Sarah's car, but the man didn't hesitate. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice cut through the air, deep and authoritative, making everyone stop what they were doing. The policeman who was holding Sarah's documents turned around, irritated by the interruption, but his expression quickly changed when he recognized who was there. Suddenly, the dismissive tone disappeared, replaced by obvious discomfort. "Sir, we're just making a routine approach," said the policeman, trying to justify himself, but his voice no longer carried the same arrogance as before. The man ignored him and walked straight up to Sarah, casting a quick glance at the documents still in the policeman's hand. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. The man stood in front of her for a moment, as if to assess the gravity of the situation before speaking. Do you have any idea who you're approaching? The question was thrown into the air with frightening calm, but the impact was immediate. The older officer, who until then had seemed in control of everything, took a step back, his face losing color. The other officers, once so confident, now seemed at a loss as to what to do. Sarah saw the hesitation and confusion on their faces. No one had expected this. Shock overtook them all, like a wave that suddenly changes the direction of the tide. This woman is one of the most respected judges in this city. The man paused for a moment, letting the words sink in before continuing. And you've just made a very serious mistake. The silence that followed was even more oppressive. The impact of those words reverberated among the officers, who looked at each other for answers. The youngest policeman, who had previously spoken with contempt, was now completely silent, his eyes wide. Sarah watched them, and for the first time that night, she felt the weight of injustice beginning to shift in her direction. She knew the situation was turning, but the shock on the policemen's faces was not enough to erase what she had been through. They hadn't expected the woman they had humiliated to be someone of power, someone who could cause serious consequences for each of them. Sarah saw the same question in everyone's eyes. How could this happen? But for her, it was no surprise. The silence hung heavy among the policemen. Sarah watched the confused, intense expressions of the men around her, who were now beginning to understand the size of the mistake they had made. But that wasn't enough for her. It wasn't enough to see the shock on their faces. It was too late for silent regret. What she had suffered there at that point could no longer be erased. She straightened up, keeping her posture firm, her chest still inflated with the humiliation and anger she had been forced to swallow during that whole approach. She knew that this was the moment to act, to make each of them face up to what they had done, without the mask of authority they wore to hide their prejudice. Sarah took a deep breath and took a step forward, facing directly the policeman who had held her documents, the older one who had previously treated her as if she were nobody. Now you know who I am. His voice came out calm, but charged with a quiet, controlled fury. But what matters most here is not who I am. It's what you've just done. The policemen were still trying to absorb the information. The younger man seemed particularly shaken, avoiding the gaze of the crowd that was beginning to form around him. People with cell phones in hand, recording every movement, every word. The scene of public humiliation was now turning against the officers themselves. Sarah took another step forward, approaching the policeman leading the approach. He held up his papers as if that would protect him from the reality that had just been exposed. She stared at him, making it clear that he was not going to get away with this easily. The crowd was growing, the whispers were getting louder, and everyone was waiting for an explanation, a justification, something that would try to remedy what had just happened. Suspicious behavior? She repeated the words he had used earlier, like a sharp blade, cutting off any chance of justification. Do you really believe that it was my attitude that made this happen? The policeman didn't answer. He just stared at her, shame evident in every line of his face. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on him without turning away. Or is the only thing suspicious here the color of my skin? The words struck like a blow. The policeman took a step back, as if he had been physically hit, unable to refute the blunt truth she had just exposed. The crowd, which had been silent before, began to murmur louder, now clearly on her side. This was the moment to turn the tide, and Sarah knew she had to seize the opportunity. The anger that she had held in for so long overflowed in her words, but in a calculated way, with the dignity that they had tried to take away from her. You judged, condemned, humiliated me, without even knowing who I was. But now you will all learn the weight of what you have done here today. The indignation was not just hers, but that of the people watching the scene, who had probably already experienced something similar, without the chance to defend themselves. And now they saw in Sarah a voice for their own frustration. The policeman stood motionless, speechless, and Sarah felt the power change hands, not because of her title as judge, but because of the truth that had been revealed there, in front of everyone. At that moment, Sarah wasn't just defending herself. She was representing everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, humiliated, simply for being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong color. The murmurs from the crowd grew. The air around them was charged as if each person present had been touched by the truth that Sarah had just exposed. It was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had been through something similar, but never had the chance to defend themselves. The policemen who had once exuded power and control now seemed small, shrinking under the weight of the mistake they had made. But Sarah knew she couldn't stop there. She stepped forward, looking directly at the officer who had led the approach. He didn't seem to know what to do with his hands. Sarah's documents still clutched between his fingers. He no longer had the arrogance of before, just the shadow of a man who, at that moment, was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. But Sarah had no time for unspoken apologies. She wanted action. And not just for her, but for everyone who, like her, suffered at the hands of a system that saw them as suspects by default. "It's not just about apologizing to me," Sarah began, her voice sharp but firm. "It's about changing what you're doing. Today it's me, a judge. But how many other people go through this every day and don't get the chance? How many other lives do you damage with the same kind of approach, judging before you understand who they are?" She paused, letting silence fill the space between her words. The crowd's cell phones were up, filming every detail. She knew it wouldn't go away with time, that the empty promises of an internal review or an apology would never be enough. Sarah turned her gaze to the policeman's superior, who had recently arrived, trying to contain the damage. He seemed calmer than the others, but there was a clear discomfort in his posture. He knew that the situation had gotten out of hand, but Sarah knew that he was still hoping that everything could be solved with formal words. "Words aren't enough," she said, interrupting any attempt at a speech he might have been preparing. "I'm going to make sure you face the consequences of what you've done today." The superior looked at her, trying to keep his composure, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. He knew it wouldn't end there, and she would make sure it didn't. She didn't want another case of racism to be hushed up, treated as something small, forgotten in the drawers of some department. "No, I'm going to see this through," she continued, her voice now filled with implacable determination. "I'm going to make sure that each and every one of you understands what it means to be responsible for your actions. And you can be sure that this will not be swept under the carpet." The surrounding crowd began to stir, a few shouts of support standing out among the voices. The mood was changing, and Sarah felt the energy growing. It was no longer just her fight. Her every word resonated with the people around her, who now saw her as a force, a representative of the justice that was so desperately needed. The policeman's superior finally stepped forward, trying to re-establish some control over the situation. In a low, almost pleading voice, he said, "We are going to take action. This shouldn't have happened. We'll investigate. I guarantee it." But Sarah wasn't willing to accept empty promises, not this time. She moved even closer, facing him firmly, her words coming out cold and calculated. "Don't investigate. Make it right. Change what you do, or I guarantee you'll be the next to face justice." She knew she wasn't alone in this fight. And more than that, she knew that she now had the opportunity to make everyone watching understand that the excuse of a repeated mistake would no longer be tolerated. The silence that followed Sarah's last speech weighed like lead in the air. The police officer, pale and tense, was clearly struggling to process her words. There was no escape. He knew that any wrong step now could put his career and that of his subordinates at risk. But the real weight of the situation was not just on them. Sarah had turned that personal humiliation into a bigger fight, and the crowd watching knew it. She felt their gaze on her, attentive, waiting for more than empty promises. The feeling of injustice that had hung in the air since the beginning of the approach was now turning into something more. A demand for action. It was no longer enough to apologize. It wasn't enough to hope that it would be forgotten. Sarah had the crowd on her side, and that was a powerful weapon. She looked around, feeling the tense atmosphere turn into something heavier. Those policemen who had once intimidated her now looked small, crushed by their own arrogance. And more than ever, Sarah knew she had to persist, not just for herself, but for everyone who wouldn't get the chance to fight. This isn't going to end here, she said, her voice firm and implacable, staring straight at her superior. I want concrete measures. I want to know that you are committed to change because I will be watching every step closely. His eyes tightened, the tension evident in the way he held his hat between his hands. Sarah could see the nervousness in every gesture and knew that he was desperately trying to maintain control, but she wouldn't give him the chance. We'll cooperate, ma'am. We'll make sure that, he began, but Sarah quickly cut him off without missing a beat. It's not about cooperation, she retorted, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. It's about responsibility. It's about making sure that this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone. I'm going to see this through, and you're going to have to answer for what you've done. She watched as he struggled to find words, clearly unable to formulate a response that would diffuse the situation. The surrounding crowd murmured, now more agitated, sensing that something big was about to happen. Some shouted words of support, others simply watched, filming with their cell phones. It was impossible to ignore the fact that this moment had already slipped out of the police's control, and Sarah knew that they were trapped. She took a deep breath, gathering all her inner strength. The battle wouldn't end there. They could try to hide behind procedures and excuses, but Sarah had already made her choice. She would see it through to the end, without letting the power and authority of the police drown out the truth once again. Every person watching knew that her fight was also their fight. Don't think that this will be forgotten, Sarah concluded, looking at the group of police officers one last time. Justice cannot be served by appearances. I'm going to make sure you understand what it means to do justice for real. With those words, she turned her back on the police officers, walking towards the crowd who now saw her as a leader, a woman who had not only defended her right, but also that of everyone there. The road to justice was just beginning, and Sarah was more than prepared to face whatever came her way.